Okay. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Alan Ahn, Director of Programs and Communications for the Global America Business Institute, Gabby. Welcome to this roundtable workshop hosted by Gabby, obviously a virtual workshop, doing this in partnership with the Korea Institute of Energy Research, KIR. I believe a few folks from KIR are joining this workshop from Korea. It's very late in the evening for them, so thank you guys for joining us today. Hope everyone and their loved ones continue to be safe, healthy, and well during this time. This discussion today is focused on the latest developments in energy storage. I'm proud to say that we have an excellent set of speakers for this topic. Three of them, in fact, and we only have an hour, so I'm going to keep this introduction very brief. Progress in energy storage goes beyond just the technology. There have indeed been noteworthy innovations in the technology in recent years, but there have also been significant developments in policies and markets. Perhaps most notably in FERC's Order 841, which has sought to open participation for energy storage in US electricity markets. Our good friend Job Henning, he's Managing Director at Auxano Strategies. He's going to kick us off, give a broad outline of today's conversation. We will then have Stephen Sparber. He's a partner at Nelson Mullins. He's a late addition to our panel today. He'll focus primarily on the regulatory policy side of things, including the FERC order. Thanks again, Steve, for joining us on relatively short notice. Lastly, we have Gabe, who's Vice President of Finance and Business Development at Urban Electric Power, who will speak from the perspective of an energy storage technology developer. So after the formal remarks have concluded, we'll then open things up for Q&A. As laid out in the email, you can submit questions by raising your hand through the Q&A button or emailing me at alanon@thegabby.com. So Job, Gabe, Steve, thanks so much for your time today. Job, please start us off, and we're looking forward to a great discussion on this very important issue.
Thank you, Alan, and a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to Gabby and KIR for hosting and sponsoring this very interesting, important event, and very much appreciate Gabe and Steve for joining this event, talking about some really different, important elements that are coming together to drive the current state of energy storage. We're going to do a sort of an update here, as Alan talked about. We talked about this a couple years ago. And we're going to look at sort of where we've gone over the last couple of years. How has the present sort of lived up to some of the forecasts we've looked at in terms of price points and market developments and deployments. And we're going to try to dovetail, before we get into the Q&A, some of the issues around manufacturing. And just to point out, Gabe's group, Urban Electric, does some development, but they're kind of primarily a manufacturer of energy storage, non-lithium energy storage. We're going to talk about how that manufacturing is coming together with markets and what that sort of bodes when we look towards the future of the industry. We certainly understand there's a broad set of global trends going on in energy storage. Today, we're going to look primarily in the context of the US market. There are some parallel things going on in other markets, but the US market is complicated enough, as you'll hear the word a couple times here, a very balkanized market, both in terms of chemistries on the manufacturing side and in terms of regulatory frameworks and markets on the other. Just to kind of helicopter up at the beginning, just to refresh our memories on kind of why we're focused on this. Energy storage, obviously a critically important part of grid modernization. We're going to focus on that primarily in this conversation. Energy storage has other markets and other things happening. You see deployments of energy storage in obviously transportation and other sectors. We're going to focus on grid modernization, and the top level issue, of course, is decarbonization trends in the grid. And with those decarbonization trends, you're increasing renewable penetration levels with intermittent generation, which both creates energy and capacity issues, as well as different changes in the ability of load-serving entities to provide non-inertial ancillary services. Energy storage also can be critical with helping migrate to a more decentralized grid, which of course is part of the overall grid modernization and direction of the grid, enabling it to better handle bidirectional voltage flows and basically allow a more decentralized resource environment. Quick overview of the past. We're probably all pretty familiar with this, but you know, at a top level, 99% of energy storage deployed in the United States is in fact a lithium-ion chemistry, primarily using cobalt. We're going to get to that a little bit later and talk about what that means. Price points, huge trends downward from 2010 to 2016, about 70%. Those downward trends are starting to slow. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of how that's happening and what that means. But we went from a levelized cost of energy of about $800 a megawatt hour in 2013. Speaking here in terms of energy, so the actual discharge of energy, $800 a megawatt hour down to 187 megawatt hour in 2019. We're getting to the point where energy storage at that level is competitive with other dispatchable resources. Steve's going to talk a little bit about how that's happening. Certainly in projects like the Excel Colorado bids, we saw some extremely low hybrid resource bids at $36 megawatt hour combined with storage and solar and storage combined rather. That's very exciting and also indicates the possibility of energy storage moving into pure peaker applications on the grid. And you know, one question I'm just going to put out there at the beginning, which I think is really, really critical here. We have all these fantastic things happening in R&D and on the manufacturing side, all of which are critically important to growth of the industry. And then on the market side, we have a lot of developments creating new compensation models and trying to standardize compensation models across the US grid. But as the PV magazine recently pointed out, the big thing that's really going to change this market and allow it to break out and scale is pretty much similar to what happened with solar. It's going to be about the standardization of energy storage as a commodity so that project finance and investment grade tools can use it in their markets with more certainty and scale it. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of the obstacles and opportunities as we look at that question. At a high level, I'll just sort of preface Steve's comments, kind of lay the groundwork for some of the key questions here, and just try to allow us to think about some of these things in the different baskets in which they reside. You mentioned, Alan, FERC Order 841. We're a couple years into that FERC order, and that's the most recent order from FERC governing how market operators deal with energy storage and deployment of energy storage. 841 essentially is just, as many may know, requiring wholesale market operators, RTOs, ISOs, power pools in the United States markets to allow non-discriminatory access for energy resources in grid deployed environments, meaning simply that if they're providing something that has characteristics that are equal to and at economic cost equal or lower to other resources, they need to be allowed to participate in those markets competitively alongside other types of asset classes. It doesn't do more than that at this time. So I think it's important to recognize, and Steve will talk about, that does create a nationwide rule, obviously, that governs how wholesale market operators have to treat energy storage resources, but it doesn't necessarily stimulate the growth of the market. And in fact, most of the growth of the market is happening in what's called the hybrid resource environment, where you see energy storage paired with the other generation assets or used in different configurations behind a combined set of resources. The regulatory environment for hybrid resources, very balkanized. There is no national rule set. Steve's going to talk about that a little bit more. That does matter because you see some huge growth of those growth numbers I gave earlier. The vast majority of those numbers are happening in hybrid resource environments. Given the balkanized nature of the regulatory frameworks for those applications, there are some questions about where they go from here and what sort of appeals there might be there as we look at a further standardization of some of those requirements across wholesale markets. And then lastly, last basket, of course, just not something we'll probably spend a whole lot of time on today, but just to keep it separate in people's minds, the utility distribution resource environment is not a trivial area for energy storage deployment, both in terms of utility-owned assets that are rate-based, as well as privately owned and deployed and aggregated dispatchable resources at a distribution level. That constitutes probably about 30% of current deployment levels, but that is all operating in a state-based Public Service Commission regulated environment. On the manufacturing side, I think the DOE Energy Storage Grand Challenge and some questions around strategies for onshoring supply chains with lithium-ion and cobalt, and the interest in the abundance of zinc in the U.S. Are some key questions, I think, when people think about new chemistries. On the other hand, I think, Gabe, everyone's interested in sort of the balkanization of chemistries. We already have a lot of different chemistries in the market. To what degree do you have more diversity in chemistries kind of cut against the goal of getting to investment grade commodified products in deployment and financing for the industry? Look forward to hearing about what Gabe's group has been doing over the last couple of years and what that means for the growth of the market. So that's sort of a high level overview here. I see I've already talked too long. Sorry there, Alan. I'm going to pass the conversation to Steve now to pick up and delve into some of the regulatory and market development questions. Steve, of course, having began his career at FERC, has a good national perspective and spent a lot of time in private practice, but a fair amount of time in PJM as Associate General Counsel up there. So deep experience in energy storage deployment in wholesale markets at one of the most progressive RTOs on this, I think I can say that in the US. So Steve, thanks for joining us, and look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Joe. And I do have to say I was only counsel at PJM, but I will take the promotion retroactively. So thank you for that. But good morning or good evening to everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. And thank you to Alan and Gabby and the entire organization, and Kier as well, for inviting me to speak, and looking forward to speaking to everyone about this. So I'm just going to, before diving into the 841 and the different rules, I think it's important for just to have a very brief overview of the U.S. power sector and give an idea of what 841 actually applies to. So the U.S. power sector at the wholesale level, about 2/3 of the country are served by these deregulated wholesale power markets, commonly called RTOs or ISOs. I'll just refer to them as RTOs. There's 7 of them across the country. 6 of them are regulated by FERC. Texas's RTO, which is called ERCOT, is actually not regulated by FERC. So if I ever refer to ERCOT, I think it's important to recognize that is not actually regulated by FERC. The reason is because Texas's grid is actually self-contained within Texas. And so since it's all self-contained within the state, FERC actually technically doesn't have jurisdiction over it. So about 90% of Texas is not regulated by FERC, even though it is an RTO. And one of the larger ones, and actually one of the better RTOs for storage and renewables. So at the outset, it's important to note that 841 only applies to equal access for renewables, primarily for storage, in the RTO markets that are regulated by FERC. It does not address issues such as Joe mentioned, does not address issues related to utility versus private ownership at the distribution level. It also doesn't address RFPs that are maybe requests for proposals in state mandated procurements. So, I'd say today one of the major drivers of hybrid resources, solar plus storage, wind plus storage, solar plus storage, have been requests from utilities, often in response to a policy mandate from a state in order to procure storage. So for example, in California, there have been a lot of procurements from municipalities where, California or Massachusetts is another state where the state have said, the utilities have to go out and procure a certain amount of storage, especially around meeting, peak system needs. So you can envision deploying storage and hybrid resources in order to, not require the build out of a new natural gas plant to meet peak needs. And a lot of times those the utilities will actually go out and request proposals for storage projects, and that's where some of those have actually, to date, there has been a good amount of hybrid resource development in response to those RFPs. All of that is outside the scope of 841, and really to some extent also outside of FERC's jurisdiction entirely. So 841, and it isn't, I don't want to diminish the importance of it, it's a landmark order, but what it does is it requires RTOs and all RTOs to grant equal access to their wholesale markets to storage resources. Not every RTO had been as progressive as some others, especially, so PJM traditionally had been a leader and has been a leader in storage, in particular being able to earn regulation and ancillary service revenues from ancillary service markets in PJM. That ability for storage to earn those revenues predated 841. What 841 did was standardize the open access to the wholesale markets for storage. And it was really, just historically, what it was really focused on were sort of the distributed types of storage, especially if you think around, things like Tesla power walls and things of that nature, or, standalone storage batteries that can be grid connected and provide those services. That's really what it was aimed at. And I think it did a good job standardizing the rules across the country, bringing along certain RTOs and requiring them to provide open access where they maybe hadn't before. But for the RTOs such as PJM and CalISO, where they had been further along in allowing storage participation, it didn't really. And I like to hear Gabe gave his point of view as well on this, and also Job's later. But at least for a lot of developers and folks that I speak with and people that I represent, it didn't change much on the ground from a day in and day out basis in the RTOs where there had been they'd already been further along, per se. In places like in other RTOs that were further behind, it changed it. But overall, like if you're a developer in PJM, I really don't think things changed all that much after the passage. Although certainly there were some changes, but standardizing all the rules of the road is certainly important. So I don't want to diminish that. But where the storage market in the US is going, as Joe mentioned, really is around hybrid resources, pairing storage with, especially with renewables, wind resources, and solar resources, and hybrid resource participation in the RTOs and the rules around how these resources are modeled, how these resources are allowed to participate and what revenues they receive, how you value their capacity, all those types of issues which are very important to storage and development in general in the context of hybrid projects. All those sorts of issues are outside of the scope of 841. Also, what is outside the scope of 841 is storage as a substitute for transmission. So oftentimes you'll hear that, well, you can build out storage and that will offset the need for a utility to build a new transmission line. That issue is also outside the scope of 841. So that being said, there's a lot of movement at the RTO levels that are happening at the state levels to deal with these issues, but the market in the US is balkanized. So, for example, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, they had a proposal going on at FERC that would allow utilities to utilize storage as a transmission alternative, or storage to be an alternative to transmission, pardon me, but it only allowed utilities to do that. So there are a lot of questions about, can independent power producers provide the same solution, but then they weren't allowed to get the same types of rate treatment. So that actually is an open proceeding at FERC. And full disclosure, I have a client, American Wind Energy Association, that I represent in that. But that's an example of those types of technical issues, which are very important, are still being developed, but they're outside the scope of 841. And there's a lot of discussion still happening at the regional, at the state level. So there is, though, I'd say, some really good, that all being said, with respect to hybrids, there have been some very positive development related to hybrids nationally and also at the regional level. So many of the RTOs are undertaking their own stakeholder processes and discussions, trying to standardize rules related to hybrid resources participation within the RTOs. So California, which has its own RTO and is subject to FERC's jurisdiction, is very far along, I'd say, in hybrid resource participation. PJM has a stakeholder process, and ERCOT, which is the Texas RTO, even though it's not regulated by FERC, actually has some is pretty far along in terms of the RTOs in allowing for hybrid participation, standardizing those sorts of that sort of participation. And there's a lot of discussion going on in PJM right now around hybrid resources and how do you measure their storage, how do you measure their capacity value, how do you model them for participation in the energy markets and ancillary service markets, and all that leads to rules of the road that will eventually allow these resources to be better, forecast what their revenues are going to be that can be more easily financeable. Also, FERC announced last month that in July 23rd, they are going to actually hold a technical conference on hybrid resources. So that will actually be FERC having a technical conference to learn more about, hybrid resources generally. Now, whether and when that leads to a national rulemaking remains to be seen, but FERC has taken that step to have a technical conference on hybrids in July, which should be commended. But I think what that says is that large-scale national standardization for hybrids is still far away. And also, to some extent, just given the nature of how the U.S. power market is regulated, there will always be some level of balkanization. Even with 841, for example, it didn't apply to markets that do not have an RTO, and it doesn't also apply to Texas, which is a big potential growth. So growth opportunity for the storage in the U.S. and renewables in the U.S. So I think just that's important to keep in mind. There are opportunities, there will continue to be opportunities, but certainly, to use a sports analogy, since at least I'm missing sports very much in the United States, we're sort of in the second quarter of, thinking 4 quarters in a game. We're in the second quarter, I'd say, for storage development and policy in the U.S. 841 to some extent was almost, in my, if you want to use an analogy, it was almost the end of the first quarter. But we're in the second quarter, maybe approaching halftime. But there's more to do. There'll be more standardization rules coming out, more issues are developing, more issues that will arise, more technical questions need to be answered, and all that will eventually lead, I think, to better, long-scale deployment of storage and renewables in general. But we still have a ways to go, which is great. We still have a ways to go. In terms of, one other thing Joe pointed out, and I will then defer to Gabe, because Gabe, I definitely is the person to give the perspective on this, the commercial perspective. What's driving storage deployment to date? I mentioned RFPs and responding to them, and renewable developers wanting to pair their resources with storage. There are some cases for standalone storage, even both in the markets and in the RFP context. But I think also another thing what's really driving hybrid development in particular from renewables, if you look at interconnection queues across the country, there's a lot of solar plus storage in particular. And despite the fact that there's still no standardized rules for measuring, for example, capacity value of storage or ancillary service value of storage, or some ambiguity there, there's still a lot of projects in the queue that are hybrid. So the question begs, well, okay, well, why are people actually developing this project? Rules aren't set. And at least anecdotally, what I've heard from a few of my clients, which are solar developers, this is anecdotal, not a scientific final answer, but it's that because of the price drops of storage technology and the rapid decrease in pricing, it's now economic for a lot of solar developers in particular to pair storage with a resource if the only benefit they get out of it is an extra hour or two of power generation, particularly in the evening when prices may be higher, but the sun isn't shining. So I think what that says, which is really important, is that even if only one potential revenue stream is being accessed right now, extra energy revenue, right? there's a lot of potential upside and growth around capacity and ancillary services that can be added to the in that there's still, in many instances, not every case, not in many instances, largely untapped, and especially in the RTO market context. I think that's those additional revenues and additional value stacks can be unlocked in the RFP context. But if you look at just widespread participation in the wholesale markets, you know, in terms of how are developers getting their projects financed today, even if the rules are not set entirely. As I said, this is in the context of listening to renewable energy developers. It's because the benefit they get from a few extra hours of energy today, even if you just look at that, in many instances justifies the added expense of adding storage. So I think, as I mentioned, what that says, it's very good. It really, you know, is a testament to the manufacturers and the industry for bringing costs down so much. But there's also a lot of upside and ways to go once we get the regulatory paradigms set. So with that, I think I'll hand it off to Gabe, and thank you very much. Looking forward to hearing for Q&A at the end. And I think Gabe's next one.
Thank you very much, Steve. Much appreciated for that overview and in-depth review of where we're at in market developments in the U.S. And Gabe, on the manufacturing side, you're sort of the other side of this equation. Your industry has obviously been really central to driving down those price points, which, you know, may not be always so great, I guess, from your perspective as a seller of products. But you have a really interesting configuration in terms of, you know, I don't know how much you want to talk about sort of your overall strategy, but having a large conglomerate, a multinational conglomerate as a major investor, having the government tech transfer or the university tech transfer out of CUNY in New York has put you in a position where you're kind of able to sort of weather the storm. You've been around for quite a few years. The marketplace, part of driving those price points down, as we all know, has driven some people out of the market. You all have stayed into the market. You diversified what you're doing. You've got an interesting COVID pivot you're in the middle of now. But as you sort of look at, you know, where the market's been, where it's gone, you've hung in there. Maybe you could just share with us some of your strategic perspectives on your experience and, you know, how you see the sort of opportunities that Steve is referring to there when you're thinking about your products and where they get deployed.
Sure. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction. That's great. And Steve and Alan, thank you both. Also, again, thanks to Gabby and Kier for hosting and all the participants for joining. So maybe to get started, let me just give a quick background on the company, how we were founded, the mission. You know, we really are a battery technology firm. And as the name implies, we initially started to tackle the issues around urban energy use, specifically grid congestion, that we saw firsthand in New York City, where the company was first started. And within that context, there's obviously significant limitations of what types of energy storage, certainly in 2012 when the company began, can be sited within buildings inside the city. You know, the company founders at the time had really had some great breakthroughs on the zinc battery research that they were doing at the City University of New York. So the technology itself, a zinc anode battery, by its nature is extremely safe and very good for long duration applications. So that was a little bit of the, you know, aha moment to say, this could be something to actually reduce grid congestion, help potentially defer investments in grid infrastructure within urban environments, somewhat hence the name urban electric power. But this was really just a starting point. And I think what has happened and what we found in the market and talking to customers has kind of influenced our path forward from that time. So the research initially was heavily funded by ARPA-E, as well as NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And that was really the kind of, you know, the initiator that could allow us to get to a point to spin out. And we started really small. You know, we had a small factory within New York City and actually started by building a nickel zinc battery, 100 kilowatt hour system that we installed at City College for peak demand reduction in collaboration with Con Edison, New York Power Authority. So already we were trying to get into the the grid space, but also creating these partnerships locally that we thought would help us grow in a sustainable manner. Over the course of about 4 years, the technology slowly developed, and we really focused on a zinc manganese dioxide battery. So for those familiar with chemistry or not, basically it's the same chemistry you find in a traditional primary alkaline battery, a AA, AAA. The breakthrough really is to make that rechargeable at scale. In other words, hundreds to thousands of cycles, large format batteries that can be used for energy storage purposes, and really creating something that is not only safe, but actually can be made at a very low cost using earth abundant materials that have very well established domestic supply chains based on that existing primary battery market. To a rough approximation, primary batteries are something like a 50 billion unit per year manufacturing industry. So there's really a lot going on there that we can leverage and sort of jump in without having to create much from scratch. So as we developed, we actually, as Joe mentioned, established a partnership in India with a large conglomerate called Godrej and Boyce. They are a Mumbai-based manufacturer and supplier of a variety of consumer products. They're very large in India, though maybe not so much in other parts of the world, but it is a big market for us, and one where they identified zinc batteries being very good for home backup solutions. Currently in the Indian market, areas, and in many markets really for that matter, where grid reliability is not that strong, having a lead acid battery or even a small portable generator in your home is not uncommon. And so the hope was to get lead acid batteries, get diesel out of homes, and put in a zinc battery that could be, is much more safe, less toxic, doesn't have the environmental implications that lead does. And so already we were seeing a bit of a pivot on our end from, well, are we kind of a grid scale company that's trying to build something for T&D deferral, or are we going to look at the consumer market? And so we started down that path and actually found quite a bit of success, not only in the Indian market but locally. There are customers right in our own backyard who are looking for substitutes for diesel generators, who perhaps would like a power wall but maybe are concerned with the safety track record of lithium, or frankly just don't want to pay the price of a power wall. We can, in an ideal world, go lower than that. Obviously now we're sort of at a pilot scale manufacturing still, but on paper, zinc batteries are much cheaper. And so through that partnership, I'll speak to it a bit more, with Godrej and Boyce, we were able to scale up our operations from a small factory in Harlem to I would say a moderate pilot scale facility outside of New York City. So this facility today is capable of testing and manufacturing, roughly 100,000 of our battery cells per year. So we're able to satisfy fairly large commercial orders, and at the same time continue to develop our technology to get it to a point where it can be competitive from a power perspective with lithium, and actually competitive on a cost basis as well. So we can get those economies of scale going. So this is where we're currently operating and starting to, dip our toe into a number of different markets. We've continued to work with the initial partners we started with, Department of Energy, NYSERDA, Sandia National Labs has been a huge partner for us as well, really to help test and demonstrate the technology. So over the past 2 to 3 years, we have, project deployments in New Mexico, in New York State, that we are really trying to find the sort of the sweet spot in some ways of where does this zinc battery best fit. I think from sort of a high level business perspective, where we've been a bit, gun shy perhaps, is in this larger grid scale market where we has sort of initially looked. In New York City, where it's obviously a big market and a growing market, there have been numerous challenges around the need for UL certifications, and specifically what types and how do you get things certified by the Fire Department of New York, the Department of Buildings. Our interactions with developers have been somewhat challenging because they're in many ways not sure what needs to be done, or perhaps a little unwilling to sink large amounts of money into an untried technology. or somewhat novel chemistry such as ours in order to demonstrate something that may never come to fruition. So it's been a bit of a challenge for us in that market because of some of the uncertainty. So we have kind of pivoted a bit into that more customer, direct-to-customer product market. And so that's, I think that is something that speaks to that sort of lack of clarity in the market. The other thing I'd like to mention is with regards to sort of the broader ecosystem of manufacturing and parts. You know, lithium and certainly lead acid, and now certainly lithium, I would say too, are really matured technologies. So, you know, you have companies that exclusively make separators for lithium batteries or focus on power electronics designed specifically for those types of technologies. We don't have that luxury. We can, to some extent, leverage lead battery power electronics, but they have to be somewhat customized to really get the most out of our battery cell. In many ways, we're completely incompatible with the lithium electronics because of our voltage, which is quite a bit lower than lithium. So it makes it even harder for companies like ours to enter the market, where we have to try to find a sort of a patchwork approach to putting end-use energy systems together. So we have really sought to work with product integrators, developers who can kind of bring us to market. I think that's from a business perspective, that's our approach. It's something we realize we can't really do on our own. We are a battery manufacturer and technology company at our heart. We're not a developer. We are not a project implementer. So that creates one set of challenges, but also some opportunities for us. And I think one thing also I'd like to mention, building on something Steve had said, you know, we've had some very interesting feedback from customers, specifically residential customers, on the role of solar and storage, and not just the customers, but the developers who work with them, where some of the utility-based schemes that are emerging. For instance, you see Green Mountain Power in Vermont has a sort of a virtual power plant model where usage is able to be regulated, battery usage is able to be regulated by the utility, save the customer money. Generally speaking, we found customers are less interested in energy storage for the potential financial returns or the sort of the ROI. They really appreciate the backup power component. And what we found is especially true is that when a grid-tied solar system, when the grid goes down, a grid-tied solar system cannot be used. So that customer is effectively out of luck if their power's out. A lot of times that becomes somewhat of a shock to them, where they said, I wish I could use my solar right now. You know, I'm sitting here with the lights off. But with our battery, or really any battery, you can create a bit of a microgrid that can somewhat obviate that. I mean, there's some certainly work you have to do with the utility there. However, that creates a much more compelling value proposition we've found to customers, that they can have long duration power backup with their solar. So that's another area we've really focused on, both in the sort of on-grid and off-grid setting, just providing small solar storage systems for end-use customers. So it's definitely been a learning experience for the company, who really is very technically focused in their makeup. And so trying to understand really the market approaches has been a bit of a trial and error process. However, we have taken great pains, as Job said, to focus on sort of slow growth, trying to avoid overextending ourselves from a manufacturing perspective, from an investment perspective, before having the market in place and being able to sort of firmly execute. The last thing I'll leave with is really hitting home on our focus on domestic manufacturing. I think what we're seeing, especially through this pandemic, the value of stable supply chains is really crucial. And, you know, zinc, manganese dioxide, two of our major active ingredients, are found really all over the world, but also found in large quantity in North America, in the US in particular. So that is not only an advantage to us, but something very attractive to Department of Energy and others that we're working with to help build this domestic manufacturing sort of industry that really can be scaled back up. In my mind, I mean, the cost of building plants like ours is actually quite low relative to lithium, considering the the safety of the products. And so it presents a really compelling opportunity for economic development in the U.S. So with that, I'll turn it back to Job. And
fantastic. Thank you very much, Gabe. And I do applaud you and Urban Electric for what you've done, playing the long game, incrementally growing and innovating without kind of putting all bets on one thing. You guys have done a great job. We're all sort of familiar with sort of the valley of death from all the great support you can get in early stages of R&D, and maybe there's some loan guarantees to help you kind of grow, but at a certain point, getting from some great technologies that are tried and true and proven and approved to actually deploying at scale is a really important question for this set of issues. So with that, I'll pass it to Alan if you want to help us with the questions.
Sure. So I have actually received a question, and this may have been my question anyhow, but from Wes Patrick. He's from the Southwest Research Institute. The discussion, he asked, the discussion mostly on batteries. What about other storage technologies such as pumped hydro, compressed air energy storage? How is the market addressing these? What are sort of the relevant developments on these technology areas?
So, Steve, I don't know if you want to talk about that. I mean, we're primarily, we've been focused on chemical energy storage, I think, in the context of this conversation and the fast response characteristics of chemical energy storage for, specific applications in grid functions. That said, it's important, I think, to note that energy storage is itself a diverse area, and there's a lot of good growth in compressed air, subterranean compressed air, and pumped hydro applications. I do feel, and Steve, you can comment if you like, but I do feel that a lot of those, although they have obviously very different characteristics from a construction and technology and permitting point of view, and are very site specific. So obviously you can't deploy them in the same way that you can with chemical energy storage by and large. That said, they do sort of fit into some of the challenges and some of the obstacles or opportunities in market development. Steve, would you say that's a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. So to put a finer point on it, and we have been saying storage or energy storage. So, but just to be clear, so what 841 addresses specifically is what they call electric storage resources. And I'll paraphrase the definition. It's basically any storage resource that's electrically connected to the grid and then can provide services to the grid, right? So whether the technology type is a lithium-ion or something else, that doesn't matter. But 841, and indeed a level we're talking about, it's the grid service. It's electric service resource. So it doesn't account for thermal storage, as an example, which is a whole other set of potential applications as well. But thermal energy storage resources are not addressed within the scope of 841, and it's a different set of challenges that they could provide. But any sort of resource that type, whether it's lithium-ion or anything else that can be electrically connected to the grid, is within the scope of what we're talking about. So to the extent compressed air could help with electric connectivity, it would be within the frame of everything we've discussed. Importantly, though, also pumped storage has been around for quite some time in participating in the RTOs. And so, and I mean, I should, in PJM at least, like the largest storage resources that they are pumped hydro facilities. And so they're already really, I'd say, let me rephrase this. There have been rules in place for several years prior to 841 that have enabled pumped storage in particular to effectively participate in the RTOs in several different ways. What 841 at a really low level we're talking about deals with grid connected storage resources and electric storage resources in particular. So to the extent any technology type could fall under that, as it to be 99% of the market today is lithium ion, but it could be something else. But it's in any technology type could be connected to the grid and be an electric storage resource, that would be covered by everything we've been talking about. Thermal, though, is different, and there's really a whole separate discussion. I don't know, Gabe, anything else for you to, any other thing from your perspective, like to?
Well, I was just going to quickly add. So while pumped hydro is, of course, the vast amount of currently deployed energy storage worldwide and in the United States, in fact, the largest ones not far from here in Virginia, they were developed under really different environments for really different purposes. So like the one in Virginia, of course, is for allowing baseload coal generation to run at a very high capacity factor, and then they use pumped hydro in a hybrid configuration. Not applicable at all today, given most of that coal is offline or going offline. That said, there's a first FERC approval permitting for pumped hydro in Montana, first in a couple of decades. So there is a return of this to the space. I think it's being pulled to this space by the same overall market characteristics and drivers we've been talking about. There are some innovations in the technology around a single turbine shaft that does allow it to emulate some of the faster response characteristics from pump to generation that was not present in the first generation of that technology. But that said, obviously, a very, very different technology and a very, very different characteristic in terms of overall energy storage and capacity.
Okay. Thank you guys for your reflections
Agree with all
on that. I have another question from Dr. Choi, Sungjin Choi from Kier, actually. He was talking about safety issues in Korea related to some of these energy storage systems due to some accidents that occurred last year. It's still an issue, and there have been no concrete solutions for some of these accidents. How is the safety issue of energy storage systems in the U.S. being addressed in terms of public acceptance? Gabe, I know you were talking about some of the inherent safety features of your battery technology.
Yeah, it's absolutely still a major concern in the U.S. We're seeing that as well. Currently, it's again another sort of balkanized, as Job says, situation with the fire protection standards across the country. The general sort of prevailing accepted, I would say, guidelines is around the National Fire Protection Association, the NFPA 855. So this is sort of somewhat of a national standard for energy storage systems that requires a number of certifications for UL, fire suppression systems. But it doesn't necessarily address the inherent risks of lithium. It's just a way to mitigate the problem once the problem has arisen. And what we're seeing further is it really makes it challenging to install lithium batteries almost anywhere. I mean, what has to be put into it and the balance of systems really changes the economic equation even further. So from our perspective, we see our technology as a big advantage there because we have gone through a spate of fire testing and have basically been shown to be similar to a lead acid battery. There's no thermal runaway, there's no explosiveness. So it provides us with a strong advantage, but it is a really key concern that I think still hasn't been addressed, and the industry also hasn't been able to quite catch up from a safety perspective. There are safer lithium batteries, LFP, for instance, is one example, but those also lack the power advantages that the more traditional lithium batteries have. So there's a trade-off there as well that also, gets into the economics of the system. So it to me is still a very large unaddressed item from the perspective of, how do we ultimately move forward with large scale deployments that are, to the level that are needed to support renewable energy growth, to support the grid's needs. So yeah, that's still a real challenge.
I would just tag on to that. I would just affirm what Gabe said about from being a former project developer in energy storage, is the fire suppression technologies around lithium-ion. It's all containerized, and the balance of systems sort of is accepted as a unit price, but they add a lot of cost, a lot of risk. They really they affect your configuration of where you can deploy. I think a couple things on this really important point. One is, just because a lot of these safety regulations are specific to municipalities and even smaller jurisdictions, there's not been a huge amount of effort to create some sort of national standards. It's difficult to do that with overlapping jurisdictions, but critical issue. And I'll just, final thing I'll say on that is I think a lot of the growth in this space in the United States, as we've said, has been grid connected. So we've sort of pushed off some of those issues a little bit because the deployments are happening in the middle of fields next to turbines and panels rather than in urban dense environments. And I think that as we move to a more distributed chemical energy storage application or growth, those issues are going to become more critical as a barrier.
I don't think I have questions from the audience. Maybe a question of my own. Steve, you mentioned the FERC technical conference on hybrid resources that's supposed to take place in July. And Job, as you said, most of these energy storage systems are basically being deployed in a hybrid arrangement, storage plus solar, storage plus wind. I understand that there have been some programs within DOE and national labs in talking about or working on integrated hybrid energy systems. Are there any other discussions going on sort of the federal level on hybrid resources and that might be relevant to this discussion?
Steve, you want to take that one maybe?
So there's some I can say. I know there are some, but it's attorney-client privilege. So I'm trying to think what I can say.
Okay.
No, I think at the federal level, at least, and I've not been as aware as much going on at DOE, but no, I think at the federal level, FERC and the technical conference is really the first one talking about hybrids in particular. Now, as you're, things that will impact hybrid deployment and storage deployment. So just with everything going on, and I wouldn't say this is necessarily explicitly dealing with hybrids, but it certainly will impact the storage market, is, discussions around, in light of COVID, extending certain tax breaks and deadlines associated with development of renewables. There were some tax, there are a few tax breaks that, renewables and solar and wind in particular take advantage of, that you were supposed to have had certain construction deadlines done by certain times this year in order to be able to be eligible for them. In light of COVID and supply chain interruptions, there have been a lot of issues with meeting those deadlines. So it seems like Congress is going to be, in the Interior Department of the U.S. is going to consider extending those deadlines into next year, just in light of COVID. So that isn't explicitly addressing hybrids per se, but it will definitely be a positive development for hybrid development because you'll be able to have tax equity investment in renewables. So I think that's an important development. And then, there are all sorts of discussions happening in general about what to do with infrastructure in light of COVID. So, there could be some things on hybrids in there, but I haven't been paying attention to that as much. It's a little outside my area of expertise.
Steve, anything you can say on independent tax equity ITC for energy storage and where we're at?
Sorry, the tax equity for energy storage?
Yeah, an independent ITC credit for energy storage and where we're at on that from a legislative point of view.
Yeah, and I believe, at least the end of last year, end of 19, that had been discussed. And it did not happen in terms of the tax breaks. That being said, I don't, that was pre-COVID. In light of what's happening right now, I don't know where those discussions actually stand.
Sure.
I haven't been paying as close. I've not heard anything. I know there are folks talking about just tax extenders and things in general for renewables as part of infrastructure and as part of COVID response. But, you know, in terms of exactly where that stands, I actually just haven't been paying as close attention to that personally, and I haven't heard anything specific on that yet. But that's not to say that it may not be out there. Because I just honestly have not been paying as close attention to that, the federal policy issue outside of FERC.
I've not heard it either. So, Alan, did you have another question?
Yeah, maybe a last question or second to last question. I have a question from Dr. Cho of University of Texas in Dallas. This is actually a question for Gabe. How does the zinc manganese battery capacity compare with the lead acid battery, and also in terms of cost of production as well?
Yeah, good question. So it compares favorably. As far as a capacity perspective, we are, roughly in the 50, sort of depends on the use case, but the 50 or so watt hours per kilogram mark. So around or a little bit above what a traditional lead acid battery might have. But what we found is capacity of the battery is really dependent on the use case. So we've done tests in sort of UPS scenarios, one in particular on board of a ship where we were providing backup for the communication system, where our battery in the same footprint as a lead battery showed about 3 times the capacity to do the same job. So I think anywhere lead acid is being used currently, we're a great substitute for from a capacity perspective. From a cost perspective, it's similar. Our cost of production, I would say theoretical cost of production with today's technology is at or a little bit below $100 per kilowatt hour. And that's, when you take it at scale with a scaled manufacturing facility, volume purchasing of raw materials, that can be done. Right now, we're operating a bit above that, but we're building batteries at, sort of small batch scale in New York State with kind of different, of course, labor requirements and, less automation than we might have at a sort of a global scale plant. So we see the battery right now today as being a great substitute for lead acid, both cost and performance-wise.
I think we have a few minutes left. This might take us slightly beyond our scheduled time period, but maybe a final parting question for all of you. And this has sort of been a recurring theme, I think, throughout this discussion about the outbreak and its impacts on progress, investment, supply chains, and energy storage. How do you see sort of the broader picture being affected by energy demand really going down throughout the world? I know, Gabe, you said that this actually might present an opportunity for revitalization of domestic manufacturing here in the U.S. with a lot of the resources that you guys are using being available in North America.
Yeah, I think I would say from our perspective, at least thus far, it's still, early, of course, in the whole course of this pandemic. But what we've learned thus far is flexibility and agility is key. We were actually able to fairly quickly transform our manufacturing line to produce hand sanitizer as a way to kind of keep the business running and help our local communities and first responders, fight the pandemic. So in our minds, there's really the need to think about and very quickly react to the new needs that might arise, some of which we might not even think of currently. But offhand, one thing that came to mind is the fact that people are going to be working from home, most likely in higher number. The need for home backup, for wanting to make sure you have a power supply at home you can rely on, in the kind of the worst case scenario, probably is going to be something people think about a bit more, as well as the need for backup power for, data center support, for telecom support to kind of keep everyone online. So that's something we think could be an opportunity in this new world.
My thought on this is, I think it's going to be very interesting, and in terms of its impact, in looking at the United States at least, and the storage market, but the commercial real estate space, you know, if all of a sudden you have more people working from home permanently, and that's where I think it's going to be interesting, which is how long does this go on for? But also, even if you get a vaccine, let's say a year from now, right? What's that going to mean to the change in just people's lives? Are people going to be living in cities more? If that's not the case, then do you need as much commercial real estate? Do you need as many linked microgrids? You know, how's that going to impact the storage market? Are people going to be moving more back into the suburbs and the exurbs and looking for more space? That's going to, I think, very much change. And then obviously then just changes in load patterns generally in the US. So I think those big picture issues are certainly going to impact the overall market and applications for storage. And a lot remains to be seen. I think especially when you're talking about the distributed storage space. The utility scale, it's a little different, but the distributed storage space and what gets deployed, especially at the municipal level and at the town level, that's going to be very interesting to see how that develops.
And I would agree with what Gabe and Steve said. I would just build on that, Steve, by saying the uncertainty, I think, does sort of play into a key attribute of chemical energy storage, in the sense that all of a sudden T&D deferral offsets and deferrals were sort of an interesting idea maybe for energy storage as a value proposition, but now may look different because they allow you to do something very quickly in a distributed way and essentially in a flexible way. Not that energy storage has to be mobile per se, but being able to quickly, relatively quickly deploy energy storage instead of reconfiguring particularly distribution grids, if not transmission systems, I think could play into strength for energy storage. And then, you know, going back to the the broader sort of global environment, I think the onshoring trend around supply chains, I think does, one would expect that to continue to play a factor in chemical energy storage in the United States, both in terms of domestic manufacturing as well as minerals necessary for those manufacturing processes.
Okay. Well, I think we're out of time now. No, thank you all so much, Job, Gabe, Steve. This was a tremendous discussion. Just received a note from Dr. Choi expressing his thanks for on behalf of Kier for this valuable webinar and this conversation. So thank you all for sharing your time today, and appreciate your insights and your knowledge.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you, Gabe and Steve, for joining, and for all those participating. Really enjoyed it. And just FedEx us those little sandwiches. Those are good. I like those.
We'll have to figure out some arrangement on virtual catering, I think.
All right.
All right, guys.
Thanks all.
Take care.